In a video about the exposure triangle, we touched base on the three basic camera controls we have at our disposal to control exposure, those being the aperture, shutter, and ISO. Today we're going to do a deeper dive into one of those controls, the shutter. My name is Timothy Reese, and I've worked in the television, film, and photography world as a director of photography and a photographer for nearly 20 years. Check out my videos as we cover not only the how, but also the why of various technical and creative techniques used in the creation of real images. Your camera's shutter speed determines how long your sensor is exposed to light and is referred to as a fraction of time, such as 1/60th of a second, or it can be displayed in degrees of angle, such as 180 degrees. Now that probably bears a little explanation, so let me give you some backstory on that. Now, the shutter speed displayed as an angle goes back to film days when the shutter was a physical disc. This spinning disc was placed between the lens and the film and spun at the same number of rotations as your frame rate. So if you were shooting 24 frames per second, it would fully rotate 24 times in that same time frame. If the disc was cut in half, so instead of being a full solid circle, it was only half a circle, then half the time the film would be exposed to the light when that portion of the disc was in front of it, and the other half of the time the solid portion of the disc would block the light. This was called a 180-degree shutter because the shutter was only half of a 360-degree circle. This resulted in an effective shutter speed of twice your frame rate. 24 frames per second had an effective shutter speed of 1/48th of a second. Due to the physical design of the disc, increasing your frame rate automatically increased the shutter speed, since the disc always spun at the same rate as the frame rate. If you changed your frame rate to say 60 frames per second, your shutter would automatically now be 1/120th of a second. In most cases, mechanical shutters are now more like a set of horizontal shutters, and many cameras use an electronic shutter, which accomplishes the same effect by rapidly turning the sensor on and off and doesn't have any moving parts. In modern digital cinema cameras, the user can choose to see their shutter speed expressed as either a fraction of time or in degrees. If you choose to display your shutter in degrees, to change the speed, you either increase or decrease the angle. This theoretically increases or decreases the size of the opening in our metaphorical spinning disc, which would mean that the sensor would be exposed to light for more or less time. For example, going from 180 degrees to 90 degrees is the equivalent of doubling the speed. Increasing the angle, going from 180 to 360, is the equivalent of halving the speed. When using shutter speed expressed as a fraction, if you change your frame rate, your shutter speed may not automatically adjust to maintain the desired speed of twice your frame rate. By expressing your shutter speed as an angle instead of a fraction, the ratio of speed to frame rate will be maintained regardless of your frame rate adjustments. This can be handy if you're often switching frame rates on a project or a shoot, so that you don't forget to readjust your shutter speed each time. The design of the 180-degree shutter has, to this day, established a standard shutter speed when shooting video, which should be twice that of your frame rate. So for example, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you would want your shutter speed to be 1/48th to accurately portray motion similar to how our eyes see it. Now, some cameras might not have a 1/48th as an option, but most will have 1/50th. So you can feel free to use that because it's almost close enough, right? But here's the thing, you have to keep an eye out for flickering from electrical light sources if shooting in the US at that shutter speed. A more detailed explanation on why that might occur will be in another video. One rule I want you to be more careful with is that you don't want to set a shutter speed slower than the actual frame rate you're shooting. Trying to do that is simply a practical limitation of time. If you're shooting 30 frames a second, how could you possibly have a shutter speed slower than 1/30th of a second? Well, here's the thing. Some cameras will let you do this, and here's the warning. They will allow you to set a shutter speed slower than your frame rate, but this is technically not possible, right? In many cases, what the camera's actually doing is reducing the amount of captured frames per second so that the shutter speed can be accommodated, and then stretching those reduced frames out across your original frame rate. So in the example of a 30 frames per second video, setting the shutter to 1/15th of a second would actually cause the camera to reduce the frame rate to 15 frames per second and then duplicate those captured frames back to 30 frames per second to the user's desired frame rate. Now, What this can result in is weird visual anomalies and abnormal motion reproduction. So don't do it unless you desire those effects to be baked in or permanent in your footage. So after all that we've learned so far, why not just use a 180-degree shutter, or just make sure to always maintain a shutter speed of double your frame rate and be done. The rule of 2 times your frame rate is, like many rules in filmmaking, designed to be broken once you understand it. You see, by not truly understanding the side effects of shutter speed, you lose a creative tool. Breaking this rule can lead to creative side effects, mostly manifested in how much motion blur will be presented in your video. And when it comes to photography, you are missing a vitally important understanding of what makes a sharp photo. Slower shutter speeds create motion blur. Not just in your subject movement, but also any camera movement will create blur. For example, a video shot on a tripod with no camera motion can have blurry subjects moving through the frame if the shutter speed is too slow. Now that same shot, if done handheld, will create blur in the entire image, as the whole shot will have motion in it, not just your subjects. Slower shutter can often be seen in dream sequences or anytime you want to create an ethereal or unworldly feel to your footage, so don't feel like you can never take advantage of this cool creative effect. Oftentimes, you can break the double the frame rate rule and use the same speed shutter as your frame rate. 30 frames per second, you could use a 1/30th of a shutter if you don't have much movement in your frame. This can be very handy in low light situations of non-moving subjects like landscapes, still life, or real estate, or if you're shooting an interview and you just don't have enough light and maybe your subject's not moving around a lot. I bet you can get away with it. Faster shutter speeds can result in a staccato effect, where motion in video appears sharper than we are used to. Sometimes this can be seen in action sequences where the creator wants to convey a sense of rapid motion. You might notice this effect in your cell phone video when shooting outside in bright conditions. Since most cell phones have a fixed aperture, they have no other exposure control other than their ISO and shutter speed. In a bright situation, most often the ISO can't be lowered enough, and the last control is to increase the shutter speed. This same blurring or sharpening of motion is vitally important to photography. A shutter speed that works for video may not be appropriate for a still photo, depending on the amount of movement of your subject and/or if your camera is handheld. The reason is that when we watch video, our eyes are never on a frame for more than a fraction of a second. A certain amount of motion blur is desired to blend the frames together, and our eyes are not critically looking at each individual frame for sharpness or level of detail. In order to have a sharp photo, we might need to use twice as fast of a shutter, or more depending on a few factors. Photography has a shutter speed rule of its own, and that is when shooting handheld, the shutter speed should always be double your focal length. Now, this can reduce the amount of motion introduced by the handheld operation of the camera. The focal length is important here because longer focal lengths mean a narrower field of view, which can exaggerate any sort of small handheld movement. And this really comes into play for super long lenses used in wildlife and bird photography, where it's not uncommon to see focal lengths of 400 or even 600 millimeters, which means a shutter speed ideally of 1/800 or even 1/1200th of a second. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is not going to stop motion blur of your subjects, but it will help you to reduce the amount of speed that you need to shoot when shooting handheld. And that is that many lenses and cameras now offer a form of image stabilization called IBIS or OIS. IBIS is what it's called when it's in-body image stabilization, and OIS standing for optical image stabilization when it's built into the lens itself. Now this can help you break that rule when needed, but the rule establishes a good place to start. The other factor to consider is your subject's motion. And this is where in-camera stabilization or lens stabilization will not help you. Fast-moving subjects can be blurred if you're using too slow of a shutter speed. Many photographers will often start at 1/200th of a second if they have enough light, and even faster depending on the subject. The range of photography subjects is endless, so I suggest doing a web search for recommended shutter speeds based on what you will be shooting. Knowing how shutter speeds work and the creative effects that they create is important for both video and still photography. I hope with this knowledge you'll have a better understanding of how to create sharper photos, dreamlike or energetic videos, and the knowledge of when it's a good idea to break the rules. If you want to see more camera tutorials, please subscribe to my channel and feel free to leave a comment about a future video you'd like me to make. These interactions really help to let me know that I'm on the right track in delivering videos that people will find helpful and educational. Until next time, thanks for watching.